Chapter 4. Esther on the filial relation. A month later, Dick and Esther met at the stile beside the crossroads. Had there been anyone to see them but the birds and summer insects, it would have been remarked that they met after a different fashion from the day before. Dick took her in his arms, and their lips were set together for a long while. Then he held her at arm's length, and they looked straight into each other's eyes. "Esther," he said, "you should have heard his voice." "Dick," said she. "My darling." It was some time before they started for their walk. He kept an arm about her, and their sides were close together as they walked, the sun, the birds, the west wind running among the trees, a pressure, a look, the grasp tightening round a single finger. These things stood them in lieu of thought and filled their hearts with joy. The path they were following led them through a wood of pine trees carpeted with heather and blueberry, and upon this pleasant carpet Dick, not without some seriousness, made her sit down. "Esther," he began, "there is something you ought to know. You know my father is a rich man, and you would think, now that we love each other, we might marry when we pleased. But I fear, darling, we may have long to wait, and shall want all our courage." "I have courage for anything," she said. "I have all I want with you and my father. I am so well off, and waiting is made so happy, that I could wait a lifetime, and not weary." He had a sharp pang at the mention of the Admiral. "Hear me out," he continued. "I ought to have told you this before, but it is a thought I shrink from. If it were possible, I should not tell you even now. My poor father and I are scarce on speaking terms." "Your father," she repeated, turning pale. "It must sound strange to you, but yet I cannot think I am to blame," he said. "I will tell you how it happened." "Oh, Dick," she said, when she had heard him to an end, "how brave you are, and how proud. Yet I would not be proud with a father. I would tell him all." "What?" cried Dick, going months after, and bragged that I had meant to thrash the man, and then didn't. "And why? Because my father had made a bigger ass of himself than I supposed." "My dear, that's nonsense." She winced at his words and drew away. "But when that is all he asks," she pleaded, "if he only knew that you had felt that impulse, it would make him so proud and happy. So he would see you his own son after all, and had the same thoughts and the same chivalry of spirit. And then you did yourself injustice when you spoke just now. It was because the editor was weak and poor and excused himself that you repented your first determination. Had he been a big red man with whiskers, you would have beaten him, you know you would, if Mr. Naseby had been 10 times more committed. Do you think, if you can tell it to me, and I understand at once, that it would be more difficult to tell it to your own father, or that he would not be more ready to sympathize with you than I am? And I love you, Dick, but then he is your father." "My dear," said Dick, desperately, "you do not understand. You do not know what it is to be treated with daily want of comprehension and daily small injustices, through childhood and boyhood and manhood, until you despair of a hearing, until the thing rides you like a nightmare, until you almost hate the sight of the son you love. And who's your father after all? In short, Esther, you don't know what it is to have a father, and that's what blinds you." "I see," she said musingly. "You mean that I am fortunate in my father. But I am not so fortunate after all, you forget. I do not know him, it is you who know him. He is already more your father than mine." And here she took his hand. Dick's heart had grown as cold as ice. "But I am sorry for you too," she continued. "It must be very sad and lonely." "You misunderstand me," said Dick, chokingly. "My father is the best man I know in all this world. He is worth 100 of me, only he doesn't understand me, and he can't be made to." There was a silence for a while. "Dick," she began again, "I am going to ask a favor. It's the first since you said you loved me. May I see your father see him pass? I mean where he will not observe me." "Why?" asked Dick. "It is a fancy, you forget. I am romantic about fathers." The hint was enough for Dick. He consented with haste, and full of hangdog penitence and disgust, took her down by a back way and planted her in the shrubbery, whence she might see the squire ride by to dinner. There they both sat silent, but holding hands, for nearly half an hour. At last the trotting of a horse sounded in the distance, the park gates opened with a clang, and then Mr. Naseby appeared, with stooping shoulders and a heavy, bilious countenance, languidly rising to the trot. Esther recognized him at once. She had often seen him before, though with her huge indifference for all that lay outside the circle of her love, she had never so much as wondered who he was. But now she recognized him, and found him 10 years older, leaden and springless, and stamped by an abiding sorrow. "Oh, Dick, Dick," she said, and the tears began to shine upon her face as she hid it in his bosom. His own fell thickly too. They had a sad walk home, and that night, full of love and good counsel, Dick exerted every art to please his father, to convince him of his respect and affection, to heal up this breach of kindness, and reunite two hearts. But alas, the squire was sick and peevish. He had been all day glooming over Dick's estrangement, for so he put it to himself, and now with growls, cold words, and the cold shoulder, he beat off all advances, and entrenched himself in a just resentment. Chapter 5. The prodigal father makes his debut home. That took place upon a Tuesday. On the Thursday following, as Dick was walking by appointment, earlier than usual, in the direction of the cottage, he was appalled to meet in the lane a fly from Thynbury, containing the human form of Miss M. Glashon. The lady did not deign to remark him in her passage. Her face was suffused with tears, and expressed much concern for the packages by which she was surrounded. He stood still, and asked himself what this circumstance might portend. It was so beautiful a day that he was loth to forecast evil, yet something must perforce have happened at the cottage, and that of a decisive nature, for here was Miss M. Glashon on her travels, with a small patrimony in brown paper parcels, and the old lady's bearing implied hot battle and unqualified defeat. Was the house to be closed against him? Was Esther left alone, or had some new protector made his appearance from among the millions of Europe? It is the character of love to loathe the near relatives of the loved one. Chapters in the history of the human race have justified this feeling, and the conduct of uncles, in particular, has frequently met with censure from the independent novelist. Miss M. Glashon was now seen in the rosy colours of regret. Whoever succeeded her, Dick felt the change would be for the worse. He hurried forward in this spirit. His anxiety grew upon him with every step. As he entered the garden, a voice fell upon his ear, and he was once more arrested, not this time by doubt, but by indubitable certainty of ill. The thunderbolt had fallen. The Admiral was here. Dick would have retreated in the panic terror of the moment, but Esther kept a bright lookout when her lover was expected. In a twinkling she was by his side, brimful of news and pleasure, too glad to notice his embarrassment, and in one of those golden transports of exultation which transcend not only words but caresses. She took him by the end of the fingers, reaching forward to take them, for her great preoccupation was to save time. She drew him towards her, pushed him past her in the door, and planted him face to face with Mr. Van Tromp, in a suit of French country velveteens, and with a remarkable carbuncle on his nose. Then, as though this was the end of what she could endure in the way of joy, Esther turned and ran out of the room. The two men remained looking at each other with some confusion on both sides. Van Tromp was naturally the first to recover. He put out his hand with a fine gesture. "And you know, my little lass, my Esther," he said, "this is pleasant, this is what I have conceived of home. A strange word for the old rover, but we all have a taste for home, and the home-like, disguise it how we may. It has brought me here, Mr. Naseby," he concluded, with an intonation that would have made his fortune on the stage, so just, so sad, so dignified, so like a man of the world and a philosopher, and you see a man who is content. "So I see," said Dick. "Sit down," continued the parasite, setting the example. "Fortune has gone against me. I am just sirrupping a little brandy after my journey. I was going down, Mr. Naseby, between you and me. I was decave, I borrowed 50 francs, smuggled my valise past the concierge, a work of considerable tact, and here I am." "Yes," said Dick, "and here you are." He was quite idiotic. Esther, at this moment, re-entered the room. "Are you glad to see him?" she whispered in his ear, the pleasure in her voice almost bursting through the whisper into song. "Oh yes," said Dick, "very." "I knew you would be," she replied. "I told him how you loved him." "Help yourself," said the Admiral, "help yourself, and let us drink to a new existence." "To a new existence," repeated Dick, and he raised the tumbler to his lips, but set it down untasted, till he had had enough of novelties for one day. Esther was sitting on a stool beside her father's feet, holding her knees in her arms, and looking with pride from one to the other of her two visitors. Her eyes were so bright that you were never sure if there were tears in them or not. Little voluptuous shivers ran about her body. Sometimes she nestled her chin into her throat, sometimes threw back her head, with ecstasy. In a word, she was in that state when it is said of people that they cannot contain themselves for happiness. It would be hard to exaggerate the agony of Richard. And, in the meantime, Van Tromp ran on interminably. "I never forget a friend," said he, "nor yet an enemy. Of the latter, I never had but two, myself and the public, and I fancy I have had my vengeance pretty freely out of both." He chuckled. "But those days are done. Van Tromp is no more. He was a man who had successes. I believe you knew I had successes to which we shall refer no farther," pulling down his neckcloth with a smile. "That man exists no more. By an exercise of will I have destroyed him. There is something like it in the poets. First, a brilliant and conspicuous career, the observed, I may say, of all observers, including the Bum Bailey, and then presto, a quiet, sly old, rustic bonhomme, cultivating roses. In Paris, Mr. Naseby." "Call him Richard, father," said Esther. "Richard, if he will allow me. Indeed, we are old friends, and now near neighbours, and apropos, How are we off for neighbours, Richard? The cottage stands, I think, upon your father's land, a family which I respect, and the wood, I understand, is Lord Trevanian's. Not that I care, I am an old bohemian. I have cut society with a cut direct. I cut it when I was prosperous, and now I reap my reward, and can cut it with dignity in my declension. These are our little amours propres, my daughter. Your father must respect himself. Thank you, yes, just a little tiny thanks, you spoil me. But, as I was saying, Richard, or was about to say, my daughter has been allowed to rust. Her aunt was a mere duenna, hence, in parenthesis, Richard, her distrust of me. My nature and that of the duenna are poles asunder poles. But now that I am here, now that I have given up the fight, and live henceforth for one only of my works, I have the modesty to say it is my best, my daughter. Well, we shall put all that to rights. The neighbours, Richard. Dick was understood to say that there were many good families in the Vale of Thyme. You shall introduce us, said the Admiral. Dick's shirt was wet. He made a lumbering excuse to go, which Esther explained to herself by a fear of intrusion, and so set down to the merit side of Dick's account, while she proceeded to detain him. Before our walk, she cried. Never. I must have my walk. Let us all go, said the Admiral, rising. You do not know that you are wanted, she cried, leaning on his shoulder with a caress. I might wish to speak to my old friend about my new father. But you shall come today, you shall do all you want. I have set my heart on spoiling you. I will just take one drop more, said the Admiral, stooping to help himself to brandy. It is surprising how this journey has fatigued me. But I am growing old, I am growing old, I am growing old, and I regret to add bald. He cocked a white wide-awake coquettishly upon his head. The habit of the lady killer clung to him, and Esther had already thrown on her hat, and was ready, while he was still studying the result in a mirror. The carbuncle had somewhat painfully arrested his attention. We are paper now, we must be respectable, he said to Dick, in explanation of his dandyism, and then he went to a bundle and chose himself a staff, to where were the elegant canes of his Parisian epoch. This was a support for age and designed for rustic scenes. Dick began to see and appreciate the man's enjoyment in a new part, when he saw how carefully he had made it up. He had invented a gait for this first country stroll with his daughter, which was admirably in key. He walked with fatigue. He leaned upon the staff. He looked round him with a sad, smiling sympathy on all that he beheld. He even asked the name of a plant, and rallied himself gently for an old-town bird, ignorant of nature. This country life will make me young again, he sighed. They reached the top of the hill towards the first hour of evening. The sun was descending heaven. The colour had all drawn into the west. The hills were modelled in their least contour by the soft slanting shine, and the wide moorlands, vined with glens and hazelwoods, ran west and north in a hazy glory of light. Then the painter wakened in Van Tromp. Gad, Dick, he cried, what value? An ode in 400 lines would not have seemed so touching to Esther. Her eyes filled with happy tears. Yes, here was the father of whom she had dreamed, whom Dick had described, simple, enthusiastic, unworldly, kind, a painter at heart, and a fine gentleman in manner. And just then the Admiral perceived a house by the wayside, and something depending over the house door which might be construed as a sign by the hopeful and thirsty. Is that, he asked, pointing with his stick and in. There was a marked change in his voice, as though he attached importance to the inquiry. Esther listened, hoping she should hear wit or wisdom. Dick said it was. You know it? Inquired the Admiral. I have passed it 100 times, but that is all, replied Dick. Ah, said Van Tromp, with a smile, and shaking his head, you are not an old campaigner, you have the world to learn. Now I, you see, find an inn so very near my own home, and my first thought is my neighbours. I shall go forward and make my neighbours' acquaintance. No, you needn't come, I shall not be a moment. And he walked off briskly towards the inn, leaving Dick alone with Esther on the road. Dick, she exclaimed, I am so glad to get a word with you. I am so happy. I have such 1,000 things to say, and I want you to do me a favor. Imagine, he has come without a paint box, without an easel, and I want him to have all. I want you to get them for me in Thymbury. You saw this moment how his heart turned to painting. They can't live without it, she added, meaning perhaps Van Tromp and Michelangelo. Up to that moment she had observed nothing amiss in Dick's behaviour. She was too happy to be curious, and his silence, in presence of the great and good being whom she called her father, had seemed both natural and praiseworthy. But now that they were alone, she became conscious of a barrier between her lover and herself. An alarm sprang up in her heart. Dick, she cried, you don't love me. Oh, I do that, he said heartily. But you are unhappy, you are strange, you are not glad to see my father, she concluded, with a break in her voice. Esther, he said, I tell you that I love you. If you love me, you know what that means. and that all I wish is to see you happy. Do you think I cannot enjoy your pleasures? Esther, I do. If I am uneasy, if I am alarmed, if— Oh, believe me, try and believe in me, he cried, giving up argument with perhaps a happy inspiration. But the girl's suspicions were aroused, and though she pressed the matter no farther, indeed, her father was already seen returning, it by no means left her thoughts. At one moment she simply resented the selfishness of a man who had obtruded his dark looks and passionate language on her joy, for there is nothing that a woman can less easily forgive than the language of a passion which, even if only for the moment, she does not share. At another she suspected him of jealousy against her father, and for that, although she could see excuses for it, she yet despised him. And at least, in one way or the other, here was the dangerous beginning of a separation between two hearts. Esther found herself at variance with her sweetest friend. She could no longer look into his heart and find it written with the same language as her own. She could no longer think of him as the sun which radiated happiness upon her life, for she had turned to him once, and he had breathed upon her black and chilly, radiated blackness and frost. To put the whole matter in a word, she was beginning, although ever so slightly, to fall out of love. Chapter 6. The prodigal father goes on from strength to strength. We will not follow all the steps of the Admiral's return and installation, but hurry forward towards the catastrophe, merely chronicling by the way a few salient incidents, wherein we must rely entirely upon the evidence of Richard. For Esther to this day has never opened her mouth upon this trying passage of her life, and as for the Admiral, well, that naval officer, although still alive, and now more suitably installed in a seaport town where he has a telescope and a flag in his front garden, is incapable of throwing the slightest gleam of light upon the affair. Often and often has he remarked to the present writer, "If I know what it was all about, sir, I'll be in short be what I hope he will not." And then he will look across at his daughter's portrait, a photograph, shake his head with an amused appearance, and mix himself another grog by way of consolation. Once I heard him go farther and express his feelings with regard to Esther in a single but eloquent word. "A mink, sir," he said, not in anger, rather in amusement, and he cordially drank her health upon the back of it. His worst enemy must admit him to be a man without malice. He never bore a grudge in his life, lacking the necessary taste and industry of attention. Yet it was during this obscure period that the drama was really performed, and its scene was in the heart of Esther, shut away from all eyes. Had this warm, upright, sullen girl been differently used by destiny, had events come upon her even in a different succession, for some things lead easily to others, the whole course of this tale would have been changed, and Esther never would have run away. As it was, through a series of acts and words of which we know but few, and a series of thoughts which anyone may imagine for himself, she was awakened in 4 days from the dream of her life. The first tangible cause of disenchantment was when Dick brought home a painter's arsenal on Friday evening. The Admiral was in the chimney corner, once more sirrupping some brandy and water, and Esther sat at the table at work. They both came forward to greet the new arrival, and the girl, relieving him of his monstrous burthen, proceeded to display her offerings to her father. Van Tromp's countenance fell several degrees. He became quite querulous. "God bless me," he said, "and then I must really ask you not to interfere, child," in a tone of undisguised hostility. "Father," she said, "forgive me, I knew you had given up your art." "Oh, yes," cried the Admiral, "I've done with it to the Judgment Day." "Pardon me again," she said firmly, "but I cannot think that you are right in this. Suppose the world is unjust. Suppose that no one understands you. You have still a duty to yourself. And, oh, don't spoil the pleasure of your coming home to me. Show me that you can be my father and yet not neglect your destiny. I am not like some daughters. I will not be jealous of your art, and I will try to understand it." The situation was odiously farcical. Richard groaned under it. He longed to leap forward and denounce the humbug. And the humbug himself. Do you fancy he was easier in his mind? I am sure, on the other hand, that he was acutely miserable, and he betrayed his sufferings by a perfectly silly and undignified access of temper, during which he broke his pipe in several pieces, threw his brandy and water in the fire, and employed words which were very plain, although the drift of them was somewhat vague. It was of very brief duration. Van Tromp was himself again, and in a most delightful humor within 3 minutes of the first explosion. "I am an old fool," he said frankly. "I was spoiled when a child. As for you, Esther, you take after your mother. You have a morbid sense of duty, particularly for others. Strive against it, my dear, strive against it. And as for the pigments, well, I'll use them, some of these days, and to show that I'm in earnest, I'll get Dick here to prepare a canvas." Dick was put to this menial task forthwith, the Admiral not even watching how he did, but quite occupied with another grog and a pleasant vein of talk. A little after, Esther arose and, making some pretext, good or bad, went off to bed. Dick was left hobbled by the canvas and was subjected to Van Tromp for about an hour. The next day, Saturday, it is believed that little intercourse took place between Esther and her father, but towards the afternoon Dick met the latter returning from the direction of the inn, where he had struck up quite a friendship with the landlord. Dick wondered who paid for these excursions, and at the thought that the reprobate must get his pocket money where he got his board and lodging, from poor Esther's generosity, he had it almost in his heart to knock the old gentleman down. He, on his part, was full of airs and graces and geniality. "Dear Dick," he said, taking his arm, "this is neighbourly of you. It shows your tact to meet me when I had a wish for you. I am in pleasant spirits, and it is then that I desire a friend." "I am glad to hear you are so happy," retorted Dick bitterly. "There's certainly not much to trouble you." "No," assented the Admiral, "not much. I got out of it in time, and here everything pleases me. Yet I am plain in my tasty. I propose you have never asked me I like my daughter." "No," said Dick roundly, "I certainly have not." "Meaning you will not." "And why, Dick? She is my daughter, of course, but then I am a man of the world and a man of taste, and perfectly qualified to give an opinion with impartiality. Yes, Dick, with impartiality. Frankly, I am not disappointed in her. She has good looks, she has them from her mother, so I may say I chose her looks. She is devoted, quite devoted to me. She is the best woman in the world," broke out Dick. "Dick!" cried the Admiral, stopping short. "I have been expecting this. Let us go back to the Trevanion Arms and talk this matter out over a bottle." "Certainly not," went Dick. "You have had far too much already." The parasite was on the point of resenting this, but a look at Dick's face, and some recollection of the terms on which they had stood in Paris, came to the aid of his wisdom and restrained him. "As you please," he said, "although I don't know what you mean nor care. But let us walk, if you prefer it. You are still a young man, when you are my age, but, however, to continue. You please me, Dick. You have pleased me from the first, and to say truth, Esther is a trifle fantastic, and will be better when she is married. She has means of her own, as of course you are aware. They come like the looks from her poor dear, good creature of a mother. She was blessed in her mother. I mean, she shall be blessed in her husband. And you are the man, Dick, you and not another. This very night I will sound her affections." Dick stood aghast. "Mr. Van Tromp, I implore you," he said, "do what you please with yourself, but for God's sake, let your daughter alone." "It is my duty," replied the Admiral, "and between ourselves, you rogues, you inclination too. So I am as matchmaking as a dowager. It will be more discreet for you to stay away tonight. Farewell. You leave your case in good hands. I have the tact of these little matters by heart. It is not my first attempt." All arguments were in vain. The old rascal stuck to his point, nor did Richard conceal from himself how seriously this might injure his prospects, and he fought hard. Once there came a glimmer of hope. The Admiral used an adjournment to the Trevanion and Pontchinons, and when Dick had once more refused, it hung for a moment in the balance whether or not the old topper would return there by himself. Had he done so, of course Dick could have taken to his heels, and warned Esther of what was coming, and of how it had begun. But the Admiral, after a pause, decided for the brandy at home, and made off in that direction. We have no details of the sounding. Next day the Admiral was observed in the parish church, very properly dressed. He found the places, and joined in response and hymn. As to the manner born, and his appearance, as he intended it should, attracted some attention among the worshippers. Old Naseby, for instance, had observed him. There was a drunken-looking blackguard opposite us in church. He said to his son as they drove home, "Do you know who he was?" "Some fellow Van Tromp, I believe," said Dick. "Old foreigner too," observed the squire. Dick could not sufficiently congratulate himself on the escape he had effected. Had the Admiral met him with his father, what would have been the result? And could such a catastrophe be long postponed? It seemed to him as if the storm were nearly ripe, and it was so more nearly than he thought. He did not go to the cottage in the afternoon, withheld by fear and shame, but when dinner was over at Naseby House, and the squire had gone off into a comfortable doze, Dick slipped out of the room and ran across country, in part to save time, in part to save his own courage from growing cold, for he now hated the notion of the cottage or the Admiral, and if he did not hate, at least feared to think of Esther. He had no clue to her reflections, but he could not conceal from his own heart that he must have sunk in her esteem, and the spectacle of her infatuation galled him like an insult. He knocked and was admitted. The room looked very much as on his last visit, with Esther at the table and Van Tromp beside the fire, but the expression of the two faces told a very different story. The girl was paler than usual, her eyes were dark, the colour seemed to have faded from round about them, and her swiftest glance was as intent as a stare. The appearance of the Admiral, on the other hand, was rosy and flabby and moist. His jowl hung over his shirt collar, his smile was loose and wandering, and he had so far relaxed the natural control of his eyes that one of them was aimed inward, as if to watch the growth of the carbuncle. We are warned against bad judgments, but the Admiral was certainly not sober. He made no attempt to rise when Richard entered, but waved his pipe flightily in the air, and gave a leer of welcome. Esther took as little notice of him as might be. "Oh, Dick," cried the painter, "I've been to church, I have, upon my word. And I saw you there, though you didn't see me. And I saw a devilish pretty woman, by gad. If it were not for this baldness, and a kind of crapulous air I can't disguise from myself, if it weren't for this, and that, and t'other thing, I forgot what I was saying. Not that that matters. I've heaps of things to say. I'm in a communicative vein tonight. I'll let out all my cats, even unto 70 times 7. I'm in what I call the stage, and all I desire is a listener, although he were deaf, to be as happy as Nebuchadnezzar. Of the 2 hours which followed upon this, it is unnecessary to give more than a sketch. The Admiral was extremely silly, now and then amusing, and never really offensive. It was plain that he kept in view the presence of his daughter, and chose subjects and a character of language that should not offend a lady. On almost any other occasion Dick would have enjoyed the scene. Van Tromp's egotism, flown with drink, struck a pitch above mere vanity. He became candid and explanatory, sought to take his auditors entirely into his confidence, and tell them his inmost conviction about himself. Between his self-knowledge, which was considerable, and his vanity, which was immense, he had created a strange hybrid animal, and called it by his own name. How he would plume his feathers over virtues which would have gladdened the heart of Caesar or St. Paul, and anon, complete his own portrait with one of those touches of pitiless realism which the satirist so often seeks in vain. "Now, there's Dick," he said. "He's shrewd. He saw through me the first time we met, and told me so to my face, which I had the virtue to keep. I bear you no malice for it, Dick, you were right. I am a humbug." You may fancy how Esther quailed at this new feature of the meeting between her two idols. And then again, in a parenthesis, "That," said Van Tromp, "was when I had to paint those dirty daubs of mine." And a little further on, laughingly said perhaps, but yet with an air of truth, "I never had the slightest hesitation in sponging upon any human creature." Thereupon Dick got up. "I think perhaps," he said, "we had better all be thinking of going to bed." And he smiled with a feeble and deprecatory smile. "Not at all," cried the Admiral. "I know a trick worth 2 of that. Puss here," indicating his daughter, "shall go to bed, and you and I will keep it up till all's blue." Thereupon Esther arose in sullen glory. She had sat and listened for 2 mortal hours while her idol defiled himself and sneered away his godhead. One by one her illusions had departed. Now he called her puss. Now, even as he uttered the words, toppling on his chair, he broke the stem of his tobacco pipe in 3. It never did the sheep turn upon her shearer with a more commanding front. Her voice was calm, her enunciation a little slow, but perfectly distinct, and she stood before him as she spoke, in the simplest and most maidenly attitude. "No," she said, "Mr. Naseby will have the goodness to go home at once, and you will go to bed." The broken fragments of pipe fell from the Admiral's fingers. He seemed by his countenance to have lived too long in a world unworthy of him. But it is an odd circumstance he attempted he tempted no reply, and sat thunderstruck with open mouth. Dick she motioned sharply towards the door, and he could only obey her. In the porch, finding she was close behind him, he ventured to pause and whisper, "You have done right." "I have done as I pleased," she said. "Can he paint?" "Many people like his paintings," returned Dick, in stifled tones. "I never did. I never said I did," he added, fiercely defending himself before he was attacked. "I ask you if he can paint. I will not be put off. Can he paint?" she repeated. "No," said Dick. "Does he even like it?" "Not now, I believe." "And he is drunk." She leaned upon the word with hatred. "He has been drinking." "Go," she said, and was turning to re-enter the house when another thought arrested her. "Meet me tomorrow morning at the stile," she said. "I will," replied Dick. And then the door closed behind her, and Dick was alone in the darkness. There was still a chink of light above the sill, a warm, mild glow behind the window, the roof of the cottage, and some of the banks and hazels were defined in denser darkness against the sky, but all else was formless, breathless, and noiseless like the pit. Dick remained as she had left him, standing squarely upon one foot and resting only on the toe of the other, and as he stood he listened with his soul. The sound of a chair pushed sharply over the floor startled his heart into his mouth, but the silence which had thus been disturbed settled back again at once upon the cottage and its vicinity. What took place during this interval is a secret from the world of men, but when it was over the voice of Esther spoke evenly and without interruption for perhaps half a minute, and as soon as that ceased heavy and uncertain footfalls crossed the parlour and mounted lurching up the stairs. The girl had tamed her father. Van Tromp had gone obediently to bed. So much was obvious to the watcher in the road. And yet he still waited, straining his ears, and with terror and sickness at his heart, for if Esther had followed her father, If she had even made one movement in this great conspiracy of men and nature to be still, Dick must have had instant knowledge of it from his station before the door. And if she had not moved, must she not have fainted, or might she not be dead? He could hear the cottage clock deliberately measure out the seconds. Time stood still with him. An almost superstitious terror took command of his faculties. At last he could bear no more. And, springing through the little garden in 2 bounds, he put his face against the window. The blind, which had not been drawn fully down, left an open chink about an inch in height along the bottom of the glass, and the whole parlour was thus exposed to Dick's investigation. Esther sat upright at the table, her head resting on her hand, her eyes fixed upon the candle. Her brows were slightly bent, her mouth slightly open, her whole attitude so still and settled that Dick could hardly fancy that she breathed. She had not stirred at the sound of Dick's arrival. Soon after, making a considerable disturbance amid the vast silence of the night, the clock lifted up its voice, whined for a while like a partridge, and then 11 times hooted like a cuckoo. Still Esther continued immovable and gazed upon the candle. Midnight followed, and then 1 of the morning, and still she had not stirred, nor had Richard Nasby dared to quit the window. And then, about 1:30, the candle she had been thus intently watching flared up into a last blaze of paper, and she leapt to her feet with an ejaculation, looked about her once, blew out the light, turned round, and was heard rapidly mounting the staircase in the dark. Dick was left once more alone to darkness and to that dulled and dogged state of mind when a man thinks that misery must now have done her worst, and is almost glad to think so. He turned and walked slowly towards the stile. She had told him no hour, and he was determined, whenever she came, that she should find him waiting. As he got there, the day began to dawn, and he leaned over a hurdle and beheld the shadows flee away. Up went the sun at last out of a bank of clouds that were already disbanding in the east. A herald wind had already sprung up to sweep the leafy earth and scatter the congregated dewdrops. Alas, thought Dick Nasby, how can any other day come so distastefully to me? He still wanted his experience of the morrow.